good fun with the Wagner tale.
The Wagner Group has had a cataclysmically shit time in the Ukraine war. They've lost 30,000 personnel, they've had the Kremlin tighten their grip on them regulatory-wise, and possibly worse off for them, they've lost a bunch of counterfactual money and reputation they could have earned by successfully propping up a bunch of African dictators, and spent it all on losing epically in Ukraine. This is a slam dunk, don't overthink it kind of affirmative. Let's talk about the interests of the Wagner Group, because we think there are 5 that are of some substantial relevance to this debate. The first, we think, is their reputation, because it's important for people being able to buy their services, and businesses like PMCs tend to rely on that for being purchased by African dictators who wish to be propped up. Secondly, I think their independence is of some substantial value to them. The fact is, in Russia, PMCs are illegal, and the Kremlin currently and has historically made exceptions for the Wagner Group. Any attempt, therefore, to make it less independent of its current operating power would mean it would have less capacity to do its operations, especially ones that are directly in the interest of the Russian government, which we think makes it substantially less stable, makes money flows into the Wagner Group substantially less stable. So obviously we think the Wagner Group cares about its own independence. Thirdly, we think they care about being actually efficient, as in the PMCs, it's so jargony, but they rely on a high-skilled and specialized labor force of people who are pretty good at killing people efficiently. And insofar as they have a reputation for that and actually are pretty good at that, we think maintaining that thing is probably something that they care a lot about, because it's attached to reputation from the group in its own right. But secondly, I think the leaders of the Wagner Group, and generally the Wagner Group itself, wants to avoid as much international attention as it possibly can, because typically PMCs aren't beloved by the governments of the world, and the Wagner Group specifically has been involved in relatively sussy covert operations in Africa, where it has propped up undesirable governments. Kind of wants to keep those things sort of behind closed doors, avoid sanctions on leaders, avoid sanctions on its operations that inhibits its ability to make money and to do the things that it's best at doing. So we think they probably care about that. And finally, I think if there's going to be a clash in this debate about is the Wagner Group the leadership of the Wagner Group, or is it the operation itself, which, by the way, would be an absolutely bizarre clash for them to create in this debate. I think the leadership and the Wagner Group's interests are clearly aligned, in the sense that definitionally the people who own the group are probably the people who represent it. But also, I think the stability of leaders and their reputation is attached to the ability of it to get customers and actually be resilient to shocks in the economy. So, I think that explains why we care about leaders being specifically sanctioned and hits to their personal wealth affecting the Wagner Group generally. That being said, what has the involvement of the Wagner Group been like in the Ukraine war, and what would happen counterfactually? So there's just a couple of things to note here. Firstly, the Wagner Group was brought into the Ukraine war in the summer, European summer of 2022, at a time where the Russian government was kind of losing pretty badly, and they were hoping to turn the tide in the war. And we would say that because of this specific piece of context, which the OIV would know, strategically, they have been used to absorb the most high casualty scenarios for the Russian military, because they have been deployed in the highest risk context, where there is the highest setting of death, where the Russian government has had the most lofty and ideological attempts to seize land that they don't actually have any prospect of legitimately defending with their own military, for the reason that they can count casualties that happen in the Wagner Group as not Russian casualties, which means they can deflate the casualties that exist in the war, and therefore the political capital for war becomes a little bit nicer within Russia internally. So they have suffered heavy losses as a result, having deployed in some of the most hopeless and high casualty scenarios, and have lost pretty badly as a result because of the way they have been deployed by the Russian government. Additionally, we would say their involvement has been relatively underfunded for the reason that Russia has struggled enormously economically because of the fact of enormous Western sanctions on them during the war, because they have fairly strategically constrained choices. I think they've kind of been forced into this operation for that reason, which means they have been paid very handsomely for the losses that they have experienced in this war. What then would they otherwise have done in a scenario in which they did not opt to engage with the Russian government to turn the tide in the Ukraine war? We think it's probably what the info slide suggests most of their other operations are, probably propping up dictators in Africa, in Libya, in Syria, in Sudan, who don't actually tend to require very many casualties because many of these aren't hot wars over land. And in many cases, it's just about providing the military support to bolster existing regimes, and in the process, making a whole lot of money doing that. And those regimes have a lot more wealthy than the Russian government because they are funded by oligarchs who have seized entire gold fields and are financing the Wagner Group that way, who aren't subject to democratic incentives and have been able to pay them incredibly well. I guess I'd also note that a consequence of the Wagner Group's kind of receding involvement in these kinds of PMC activities has led other PMCs to sort of take their place in the marketplace for PMCs. PMCs like Blackwater, which has been bad for their overall business. Okay. That being said, why has this been an incredibly harmful thing for them? And this is basically just impacting that characterization. First, it has led to the waning of the Wagner Group's internal power within Russia and its special status as a legal but illegal PMC. Because it has soured relationships with Russian officials, like the leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, has engaged in a lot of pretty iconoclastic public critique of the Russian government and their strategy in war, which has led to a souring of a relationship with him and Putin, has seen Prigozhin kind of been seen as a threat to Putin, which has led Putin to critique Prigozhin, critique the Wagner Group, but also the Wagner Group is engaged in a shit ton of narratives in which they have said, they're not funding us correctly, like they're directly trying to hurt us, which has soured the relationship within the Russian government, which has specifically led the Russian government to clamp down on the activities of the Wagner Group everywhere. It has required the fact they tell the Russian government about every activity they're going to do, which, as we've already established, is something that they care a lot about, having that independence to engage in those money-making activities abroad. But I think it's unlikely to happen this way in the counterfactual because, the fact that a big Russian business goes and advances mostly Russian interests within Africa and earns a lot of money in the process probably isn't something that would attract very much Russian critique from the government. So if they had just been doing that in the counterfactual, they probably would have been sweet. But in our world, this has actually harmed the independence of the Wagner Group. Additionally, it's attracted a lot of sanctions on key leaders within the Wagner Group because, yes, there was some before, right? Like, the activities in Africa have attracted some sanctions, but the West, people who have the most power to implement sanctions, care far more about white people dying in Europe in a hot conflict in which the US specifically has invested a lot of money and resources into that conflict, and it has escalated sanctions massively, which has hurt the Wagner Group, it's hurt its leaders, which has been bad for profit and bad for its leaders. Additionally, it has harmed the efficacy of the Wagner Group as a PMC. Because they've had huge casualties, which has deterred recruitment for people who don't want to be involved in a hopeless conflict. But additionally, it has killed people who are kind of hard to replace because of the labor that they have, which means it's harder to sell your wares to African dictators for people to be propped up, which is bad for them. Additionally, it's lost some credibility, which clearly I think we require a big impact from this team to overcome. For that reason, proud to attend.
We agree with the vast majority of the interests of the affirmative team with Wagner. The biggest difference I want to critique at the start of this is the claim around reputation. Because Oscar tells us that you want good reputation to get contracts. I think this is deeply confused. Like, PMCs get very few contracts, but they need very high-paying ones. And it means there's a specific niche in the market that a Russian PMC answers rather than one that is affiliated with any other countries. Basically, we are like scum.inc, right? Like, they're the worst and most vicious of the PMCs, and they've resolved that question by the great deal of scrutiny that the West has applied on this group. It's called fucking free promotion. That means every evil African dictator that wants to use the most fucked up person who's willing to commit genocide for them, which Wagner has done so in the past in African context, they pick Wagner rather than Black Hawk. So I think that's actually a weapon. But still the counterfactual, because I think this is the first place this affirmative team is going to lose this debate quite drastically. As they identify, Wagner and other voluntary military groups are technically illegal in Russia. What has occurred in the last week is Russia, in its desperation because of how bad the war is going, has decided that they're forcing these companies to sign exclusive contracts with the Russian government. And our claim is very simple. This has happened about what is it, like almost a year and a half since this war has started. Our claim is simply that Wagner has helped win the war so far, and this would have occurred much quicker. And it means the trade-off this team attempts to set up, which is you would go off and do other things and make lots of money in Africa, is something you've been able to do a little bit continually in the status quo, but you would not be able to do when this contract comes through and you're forced to listen to him. Instead, Wagner in the status quo has, however, told the Russian government to fuck off, and is able to do so because of political influence I will again explain later on in this speech. And it means the comparative this team setup doesn't work. Maybe you get 6 months of additional spending in, say, African warlords where you're making lots of money. I think it's a very small change because you're going to lose that completely, or this group will be disbanded. They are our win conditions. Let's first explain why you've helped with the war a great deal, then we'll explain why you get closer to the Kremlin, then explain the last two claims around Africa and why scrutiny is good. Why have you helped a lot in the war? The first claim Oscar tells us about this is that, well, you've lost a lot of troops, and the reason for this is Russia has put you in the most dangerous situations so that they could kind of like attribute deaths to different people. I think this is correct. It doesn't explain why all Wagner troops have been in this area, because we should probably split Wagner mercenaries into 2 groups. The first is the set of people that were part of the Wagner group kind of prior any involvement in Ukraine, like I mean genuinely like prior 2014 and those sorts of Crimea, that sort of situation. Because Wagner has always been involved. It hasn't openly declared it is in Ukraine and fighting that war for the whole time, but some of the very first troops were very much Wagner supported, if not Wagner themselves. And the claim then is actually Wagner has been very useful in this war. And the sets of troops it has lost are the ones that they've just used as convicts taken straight out of jail. They're the set of people that they've lost very heavily, and that is fine, because these people weren't particularly well trained, weren't particularly well attributed, and weren't a particularly useful part of Wagner's military capacity. The set of troops that Wagner has put in the less dangerous conflicts, in the earlier parts and use of special forces, are the people that were prior part of Wagner Group prior to the Ukrainian invasion. They're very well trained, and they've incurred far more experience because of this. And that means battles like fighting for Blackmore, which is an important choke point, the Donbass invasion, which has been the most successful component of the Russian invasion, are the parts that Wagner have put its best mercenaries in and has achieved a great amount of success. These people just are more experienced than any part of the Russian military, because the Russian military is hugely underfunded, hasn't fought a conflict for a very long time, and Wagner has been training and has been fighting, not the hottest conflicts ever, but has done actual fighting in recent times, which means they are the best troops. That means Russia has distributed them in those 2 different ways, which means both their claim can be correct and our claim, which is more important, can be correct about this. And that means that because they've helped the war a great deal, because they're an obviously patriotic group, because they are close to the Kremlin and care about these things, like the guy who set this up, like Pogosha, that also identifies was like Putin's chef, like he's a personal friend of Putin, which will explain something I will rebut about the critique later. Generally just means that they're pretty close to them, pretty friendly, and they've been used in particularly useful ways. And it meant that this war has gone far better than they otherwise would. That is ideologically useful for the Wagner Group, because they want the war to succeed. But importantly, they've just learned from the war, their soldiers are better trained, they have more experience, they've got access to better weapons. Because of that, that is an ideological goal they've achieved. But also, the success they've achieved in that context is one that they've used as advertising, right? Like, what other PMNC actively gets to say they were in a war zone and have been trained in one? Wars are pretty rare these days, thank God, but that means they've got a pretty unique advantage against any other, like Black War or anything like that we'll talk about, which means they're more likely to get contracts if reputation improves. Let's talk about the reputation of Wagner in the Kremlin and why they've become closer to them. And the first thing to identify is just they're very thankful for the success that has occurred here, because as identified in the previous argument, the Russian army hasn't done particularly well, but Wagner Group, in the areas where they've meant to succeed, rather than the areas they're meant to just kind of dull the numbers, have succeeded pretty well. Even if you don't believe that, you probably do have to believe that kind of like Putin's pretty frustrated about the war. Generally, it has not gone as well for the Russian state as they desire it to, and that means he's pretty vulnerable or pretty likely to be friendly with the set of people that are actually succeeded and are actually less frustrating to deal with. And that just means that the Russian military is pretty reliant on the Wagner Group right now, because even if you want to identify the bad losses that Wagner Group has dealt with, and even if you don't split them into the way I've identified, like the Russian military has just lost way, way more, so they are obviously pretty reliant on running out of men, noting the conscription they've done and the voluntary kind of forces they're attempting to do, I've explained in counterfactual. Which just means, again, even if you don't believe the Wagner Group is particularly successful, they're more successful than the Russian government. The Russian government is incredibly desperate and relies on you in this context. So, how does the Wagner Group benefit from the political power it accesses because of this success. The first to point out here is huge protection against that legal limbo identifying the counterfactual. The Wagner Group will get away with not complying with this particular law. Every other group in Russia that's also a paramilitary group will be forced to go on to that. And that means their legal independence that Oscar talks about is one on our side. It also means that their small amount of competition that does occur in Russia is now being totally crushed, which is pretty useful. All of this occurs far better when you're in the favorable books of the Kremlin but not if you kind of piss them off by saying, no, we won't fight your war. Second, you've just been paid a fair old bit. Oscar says you don't get paid much. We assert you do get paid much. I don't really know how you break this down other than to point out that the Russian government still does have a fair bit of money, and the Wagner Group is incredibly well off. Bogosha now has gone from really rich to basically the richest person in Russia. That's kind of an empirical fact. You should probably just know about this. The political influence that the government has is particularly useful because government backing has allowed them access to additional new higher quality weapons. Government clout allows them to kind of get recommended for more African projects in the future, and it just avoiding more of the sanctions that the West has already placed on them. And I want to note those sanctions have been in place on this group prior to the Ukrainian war because they've always known they've done things like genocide in Central African nations. The benefit here is just if you're still in Russia's good books, you get protected from those sanctions because you're allowed to put all your information, all your money, and all that stuff in Russia. But again, if you keep them offsite and you don't help them in this war, they're less likely to protect you. The next claim Oscar makes is, well, Bogosha's done a whole bunch of critiquing of the Russian state and that's particularly bad. I want to point out that Oscar just seemingly has fallen for the Russian propaganda trick. The way Putin controls his propaganda is he sets up a set of people to critique him both on the hard and left side of how much more or anti-Cold Warish he should be. And obviously he's used one of his personal best friends to critique him on being too soft on the war, has pushed Wagner, who wants the war to continue to go on so they can fight more, use more soldiers, and conscript more people from jail, to push him more towards being hardline on the war. Critiquing of this has been very good for Wagner, they've earned more money. Finally, let's explain then why the opportunity cost this team attempts to identify, absent of the counterfactual explanation I provided, is still very useful for you. The first is, you don't need many soldiers in these African countries to kind of protect your gold and diamond mines. Importantly, the scrutiny that's been placed on you in international law hasn't stopped you profiting off those things. It's very hard to track gold and diamonds, it's very easy to smuggle them and launder them, and that's exactly why Wagner gets asked to be paid in gold and diamond mines rather than being paid in dollars or rupee, which means their methods were always capable of surviving scrutiny. In fact, I thought they got more clients if they were scrutinized more. The war was going better because of Wagner's involvement. They want to win this war. Very proud to be
ask yourself why there has been such public critique from the leadership of the Wagner Group of the Russian government's strategy in the Ukraine war. If the Russian government has been as judicious in its use of Wagner mercenaries, as Tom says, the factual assertion we get in that speech is the Russian government makes wise choices about how to use these mercenaries. They do it in ways that preserves life and maximizes resources. But in that case, why is it the case that the relationship between Wagner, fat cats or whatever, and Putin has disintegrated? Why is it that they have been such public critiques of this strategy? I think that just doesn't make sense and is counterfactual from side negative. Two things then in the speech. Firstly, on the existence of the Wagner Group and its relationship with the Russian government, and then secondly, on its international success. Firstly, on the existence of the Wagner Group. So, the first thing I want to do here is just to kind of reiterate the status quo, which doesn't get a lot of response from Oscar's speech, but is really important because I think the claim that, maybe if you don't work with the Russian government on this one, they might get mad, might be a viable argument if the Wagner Group hadn't just sunk heaps of money and people for, really not a very good relationship with the Russian government. Literally just last week, the Russian Defense Ministry moves to make the Wagner Group report to them and to give them far more oversight over its operations. What that should suggest to you is, not that it's got better, and their only response is the Wagner Group is relatively powerful and so fuck you to that. But you should ask yourself if that is reflective of a good relationship or merely a kind of bad relationship where both sides have a fair bit of power. I think it's probably the latter. The second thing to note though is that just there have been enormously high-profile critiques of the Russian government and its strategy by the Wagner Group. They have publicly said that the Russian government is likely to lose. They've publicly said that they've been wasting resources and wasting money. Once again, is that the sign of a good relationship? I think not. And the final thing to say is that they just have not been that successful. Some of the best or most successful parts of the war have involved the Wagner Group. But I think you have to ask, in the grand strategic aim of the Russian government in Ukraine, has it been a success? Probably not. Like, they have gotten owned in a pretty significant way. There have been huge casualties, whether you like it or not, and that suggests that, even if it's a marginal benefit, it's very unclear to me that that is a sufficient benefit to the Russian government to, compensate for the kind of image problems that we described at last time. So, what that suggests is that even if the comparative does involve tensions between the Wagner Group and the Russian government, they need to do a lot more analytical work to explain why those tensions are worse. And what I'm going to do now is just explain that I don't think that they would be. Because their claim is like, you're useful to the Russian government, and that means that the Russian government likes you. But our claim is quite simple. It is that you could be more useful in a series of other ways in our world. What are those ways? The first thing to say is that you can obviously just do non-military involvement, or specialized military involvement in the way that the Wagner Group operated in Crimea in 2014, which is notably not intervening in the war zone, but doing things like special military operations, doing things like providing strategic advice or weaponry to the Russian government. We'll note that we think that the Wagner Group is way more optimized for doing those things. Like, they have a high degree of expertise on those things compared to the kind of more hot and dirty war, which they admit mercenaries have very little use for generally, very little experience in. So that explains that there are still ways that you can help out the Russian government that I imagine they would be relatively appreciative of. But the other thing to say is that you can just make more money and funnel it to the Russian government. And I think the Russian government really likes that, because a key barrier for them, in waging this war is simply a lack of resources, which suggests that, dedicating your operations to expanding Russia's influence in Africa, to taking money off the hands of a bunch of African dictators, probably does help the Russian government. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Russian government isn't mad at you or is best friends with you. But I think it does explain that they're not going to ban you, right? Because they still benefit quite materially from your existence. It is a net negative for them strategically to ban you. The other thing to say though is, I think on our side you actually have quite a bit more bargaining power. And what I mean by that is, in their world, what has objectively, empirically happened is you've been involved, you've been largely directed by the Russian government, you've had quite a significant increase of Russian government oversight and direction of your troops, and so you've kind of lost, I would say, quite a lot of bargaining power. And note, they say now the Russian government is increasingly desperate. It seems to me far more preferable to let the Russian government get increasingly desperate, let them rely more on you, feed them with things like weapons and strategic advice. I think that is something that systematically empowers you in a far greater way than sinking 30,000 fighters into a war which, you publicly admit you're likely to lose. So, what that materially explains is that I think it's pretty untrue that refusing to fight in Ukraine would meaningfully mean that the Wagner Group was banned. I think that just would never really be in the Russian government's interest. And I think it explains that there are a series of other, less interventionist, less costly ways that the Wagner Group can placate the Russian government. I guess the final thing I'd note is, I think a big premise in their case is just that the Wagner Group really wants to win the war in Ukraine. I'm not really convinced that's true. I think that that is probably not their primary goal here, if it is as costly as we described. I think they need to do more to prove that's true in any case. The next thing to say then is just to discuss the success of the Wagner Group, and I'm going to divide this into reputational and operational. I'll start with reputational. Our claims are, firstly, that this does make you look pretty weak in a couple of big ways. The first one is strategically weak, because you have gone along with ill-advised Russian strategies that have led to the death of a lot of people. And the second thing is that you have received more sanctions and international condemnation than you otherwise might. They're military. They're like, well, you had some sanctions before. Yes, it is worse to have more sanctions. It means you can buy less stuff and move less money and move around less. Things can get worse. But their response is well, the reputation doesn't matter because the reputation you trade on is to be scum proprietary limited. No, the thing is it's to be effective scum proprietary limited. Obviously you don't have a reputation for being a good guy, but you do want a reputation for winning. And I think that you have a much stronger reputation for winning when you do a series of successful missions in the Middle East and Africa, compared to sink a lot of resources into a failed war. The other thing to say though is that you want to be scum who can buy things proprietary limited, which is why the material we give you on sanctions is probably pretty important. That is just, I think, a necessary capacity to be able to do your job, so to speak. The other thing is operational. Our claims are you have a huge degree of lost personnel, and you have a series of costs, both opportunities costs, but also just actual costs, right? The NEG has two responses. The better one is to say, well, you helped Russia win, and so that was in some way an operational success that adds to your prestige. A couple of responses. One, I think this is uncomparative, as they know. Mercenaries typically don't really get involved in that many hot wars, so it's pretty unclear why, if your general work is to help out warlords, it's that reputationally beneficial for you to be involved in a hot war. Also, it's just deeply unclear that the way they describe, warlords, whatever, who would hire you, interpreting this as true. I'm not sure these guys are big strategic thinkers who are like, well, in the Donbass. I think they're just like, look at these guys, like literally like a client group for the Russian government, probably not particularly independent, probably just trying to take money from us to sink into a war zone. I don't think that this necessarily comes across the way they describe. And I would note it's just like largely based on assertions like, you get government clout. What does that mean? Very unclear. I think the kind of clout you get is the clout that sees you as being Putin's lapdog, sees you as making decisions that literally just strategically weaken your group. I don't think that that is good for your reputation. The other thing they do is just some mitigation to say that generally the soldiers that are dying are ones that are kind of useless and not optimized. I think this is neatly responded to by my introduction. Like, it is not clearly true that Russia did make decisions in a strategic way. Maybe we wish they did, but I think in many instances they did not. But regardless, once again, just note the huge amount of unresponded material from Oscar about the kind of trade-offs that the Wagner Group has made in pursuing this strategy. Notably that they've sunk a huge amount of resources like that they have made in their pursuits in Africa and the Middle East into this war. What that should suggest to you is even if people aren't lost in that much of volume, which I think is rebutted by the info slide, still a huge amount of money and opportunities have been. Either way, I think it's hugely regrettable for the Wagner Group. We prefer to maintain our bargaining power, we prefer to maintain our manpower and our financial power.
The way the Wagner Group operated prior to the hot conflict in Ukraine beginning at the start of last year was as a symbiote of the Kremlin almost in its entirety. It existed in legal limbo only with the Kremlin's consent and only in circumstances where it was useful. The kind of standing of that organization certainly improved after things like the annexation of Crimea, which they were pivotal in securing in 2014. But the way that you need to consider the Wagner Group now is a little bit like its own tumor, right? It's got an enormous amount of leverage on the Kremlin because if it refuses to fight in Ukraine right now, if it changes tactics, if it pulls out, if it messes with those operations anyway, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians will die. And a mission that the Kremlin has shown an extraordinary revealed preference in securing will fail. And that is an enormous amount of leverage in what was previously kind of like the Kremlin's bitch. And that is absolutely something that will allow them in the future to continue the kind of operations that will additionally make them enormous amounts of money. The Wagner Group has used the Kremlin just as much as the Kremlin has used the Wagner Group, only now have the scales begun to tip, and that is a really good thing. Let's talk firstly about what would happen to the Wagner Group otherwise, and then we'll talk about the opportunity cost. I'll start with the issue of whether they would have been disbanded or substantially harmed otherwise. But the note that I'll make here at the start of this point about the counterfactual is I think this team is just kind of piss weak in their conception of what the counterfactual is. Like the counterfactual we hear at Oscar is, well, they totally would have just done like their African stuff the entire time. And then additional counterfactual work we hear at Ellie is like, oh, well, they could have like provided weapons to the government or they could have provided logistical support to the government. So been involved in the Ukrainian conflict in a way they, by the way, are currently involved in addition to providing troops on the ground in a hot conflict. Like, that is involvement. And I think it's pretty clear from this team then that they do actually understand intuitively how linked these two organizations are, how linked their interests are. And their only squabble in this debate is like, well, it seems like lots of like really good mercenaries have died, despite the fact that we empirically point to the fact that the Wagner Group negotiated agreements whereby they're able to directly take convicts out of prison, put them as the most disposable people in the hottest conflicts in the worst parts of the war zone, while preserving our guys that they can then go on to put in more useful missions as well. They're not stupid, they're businessmen, they are in fact scumbag proprietary limited. But let's talk about what would have happened to them otherwise. The claim from side negative is very simple. The Wagner Group is an exceptionally powerful group within a state that requires as like a really, really staunch centralization of power, and particularly after the decline of prominent oligarchs. Our claim is simple. The Wagner Group has enjoyed this special kind of status and advantages and business relationships with other states and in other conflicts like the Libyan civil war, the behest of Russia, precisely because of its long-standing involvement in Ukrainian conflicts that date all the way back to Crimea, and its demonstrated investment in the ideological goal of the Russian regime, which was unification, which was like these guys are neo-Nazis, like they are actual fascists at this point. They are ideologically aligned in many instances. They would have been far worse off otherwise. Because not being involved would have required a couple of things. It probably would have required pulling out of strategic choke points around Crimea and around the border that invasions were launched from, that they have been involved in for many, many years. Would have looked like actively refusing repeated and increasingly desperate calls from the Kremlin to please, dear God, get involved and get on the ground so we do not win, so we do not lose this war and lose hundreds of thousands of Russian lives and waste and you lose enormous face on the international stage. That is what these guys would have required this organization that was a symbiote of the Kremlin to do in order to fulfill their burden in this debate and justify not being involved in this conflict. And that is ridiculous, and would have done two things, or rather it would have destroyed the two two sources of goodwill that the Wagner Group requires to survive and remain profitable. Firstly, its kind of sense of patriotism and support of the regime. All this team has to say to that, it's like, well, they've made some public statements about how unhappy they are. Yeah, they've made public statements precisely to justify giving them further power, further autonomy, and more money, saying that the Russian government isn't spending enough, that they aren't going hard enough, that they need to put more troops on the ground, that they need to be even more aggressive. That is precisely what they want. That is a clear revealed preference for ongoing involvement in this conflict. Being able to demonstrate that they are ideologically in concert with this regime, even if they disagree about strategy. Because to be clear, nobody has come out and said we should not be in Ukraine at all, we should leave Ukraine alone. They have absolutely done what they did in 2014 and said the Ukrainian government is an evil puppet state of fascists that we must clamp down upon very aggressively. And also being able to say that they are personally friendly with the Kremlin, being able to have those personal relationships so that they can enjoy that special status ongoing. The second piece of goodwill that they lose is a demonstration of their actual willingness to do the dirty work. This team says a few things. The first thing they said is, well, they don't want to look like, ineffectual scumbag proprietary limited. They want to look like guys who win at the worst kinds of tasks. I think it looks far worse to allies of the Russian regime that employ these people. Like, for instance, they only got involved in the Libyan civil war because Russia was involved, because of that network that is diametrically opposed to the global Western order there. I think it looks far worse to look like a symbiote of that state and then refuse repeated calls from that state to get involved in the one thing that you're supposed to be able to do. That looks far worse. That is the thing that loses you actual credibility. Next thing this team says is, well, but it's not a sign of a good relationship, is it, if they move to make the report directly to the ministry? One, this is something that is strained by enormous desperation. The only reason that this call didn't happen in summer of last year in the Northern Hemisphere is because of the Wagner Group's ongoing involvement that boosted that military operation. That is probably symmetric. It would have happened a year earlier on their side. Second, this targets all of the groups, not just Wagner, and many of the other groups look like they are very likely to accede to this, whereas Wagner have given them the finger, show absolutely no sign of acceding to this, and equally, the Kremlin shows no sign of trying to crack down on them further, because they know that they can't, or they will lose the war. Thirdly, though, there's probably quite a bit of strongmanning here. They probably expect that lots of people won't accede to it. That is how, media propaganda, those kinds of things work. The next thing this team says is, well, it wouldn't be in the Kremlin's interest to, disband them. Fucking why? They want to centralize enormous amounts of power away from dissidents. They would be able to absorb their resources. They would be able to disband something that could be turned against them internally. They've shown incredible willingness to do whatever it takes to solidify power to be able to deliver good outcomes on this war. Let's now see this speech talk about the opportunity cost. Let's weigh up the opportunity cost of protecting a few more gold and diamond mines on their side, or maybe being involved in one additional small-scale African conflict on their side against everything that we tell you, like the reputational benefits, many of them with Russian allies, who only got those contracts because they precisely were Russian allies. The reputational benefit of actually being brutal and lethal and willing to do whatever it takes. The actual and the actual cost of those other missions that we explained to you at time to very little response that are actually not that high. Or, for instance, the largest opportunity cost in this debate, which is not existing at all, not enjoying any special legal status, not enjoying any protection from the West, being excluded from Russian financial systems and financial systems of that group of countries that are diametrically opposed to the global Western order, that will allow you to shield your assets, that will allow you to be protected from US sanctions. The West has tried to sanction these guys. They've been trying to sanction them since 2014. They've continued to survive at the behest and the will of the Kremlin, which these guys fuck into the ground. This is obviously a terrible idea. The involvement in Ukraine, is something that the Wagner Group absolutely benefits from and absolutely wants. And if they didn't, they probably wouldn't have gotten involved ideologically in this conflict when it was way smaller, when it was back in 2014. In fucking with Ukraine is who Wagner Group is. They absolutely do not regret it.
Two issues in this speech. First of all, addressing the characterisation clash in this debate about what the Wagner Group involvement looked like in the war. Second of all, talking about the counterfactual. Let's start with what both teams agree on. Both teams agree that because Russia was in an economically weak position, they were underfunded to a significant extent, which is conceded at first negative. The second thing everyone agrees on is just that there were lots of deaths of certain amount of soldiers. They may not have been the most productive ones, but out of a paramilitary group that consisted of highly specialised soldiers all round, at least some of those highly specialised soldiers did end up dying. Let's now examine the way that they use this characterisation to win the debate and explain why it is insufficient to beat the material we give you. The first thing they do is explain that therefore, because you are more allied with Russia, for example, you get a huge reputational benefit. There are two responses to this. The first response is to explain that in conceding that there have been a lot of different deaths, it now means that you, for example, do not have the same amount of autonomy to go out and to accept other contracts, to use yourself in ways that are efficient, to have and deploy multiple different, teams to do a whole bunch of different stuff and work in conjunction with each other, which also addresses their push about how valuable you are to Russia, because for every way that Russia then uses this group as cannon fodder, or uses them in the worst situations because they have an ideological incentive to win battles that, for example, they shouldn't try to win at a particular time and point, just means that this becomes a worse asset over time, which explains why their mechanism of you are so aligned with them does not work in the long term and is at best short, maybe a few months or whatever. The second thing though is that a reputational benefit only really applies if you're doing a whole bunch of other projects and seeing it, or contracts or whatever, and seeing as how this team seems to suggest that you become increasingly integrated into the Russian army itself and then only work with them to, continue to, for example, be hugely funded. It doesn't seem that having a big reputational benefit from being the people that were in an active war zone is very useful. But finally, their push is how many military groups can say that they've been in a war zone? All of them! That's what they do! They go in and kill people in active war zones and conflict. Ridiculous. The second thing they say is that you get better weapons and money. Two responses, again. First of all, Russia has absolutely fucking shit weapons manufacturing. Their factories are 20 years out of date. It's a really important reason that the OIV would know as to why they're losing the war against Ukrainians, despite the fact that Ukraine have way less soldiers. They just technologically have a lot of ups on Russia, for example, which suggests that Russia just don't have a bunch of, special nuke laser beam, guns that they're giving these paramilitary groups that now make them super effective, right? But the thing to say is that even if these weapons existed, they consider this is already one of the richest paramilitary groups in the world, which would explain why they could probably buy the weapons they needed anyway and wouldn't have to align themselves with that. So I don't think that stands. The third thing they say is that, well, you can protect yourself from sanctions. Two responses. First of all, the protection from sanctions mitigation, doesn't work in a debate, because we explained that the sanctions are a result of doing this thing. So they're we can mitigate the harm that asymmetrically applies to our side, so that doesn't work. They try to get out of this by explaining that some sanctions already existed, but that doesn't account for the sheer volume and increase of sanctions that occurred. Specifically, because the West does not want to think of the Wagner Group as Russia's little own PMC thing. Everyone has a huge interest in, for example, this group not helping Russia to win a war, for example, that the rest of the international community has condemned. But I would also say that Russia is just not in a particularly good position to protect you, for the reason that, as is agreed by this team in the characterization clash, they are quite poor, they are losing the war in a number of ways, and as is not rebutted, we explain that support is often dwindling and dying from the public, which means out of all the places you will send resources for the war, a paramilitary group is probably not the place where you will send the most amount of resources to protect them from these sanctions. That therefore already explains why, as is explained by Oscar's setup, which is the interest of the people in this organization is to not be sanctioned, it makes them less operable, that we would win on that metric. Now, let's examine the claim that you are a super big asset to the Russian military. We defeat this though in three ways, which undermines the argument a second time and therefore allows us to win the debate in a second time. Three ways we do this. First of all, Ellie explains that you can co-opt a lot of the other benefits by simply working with them from strategic ambiguity, providing a little bit of information. Their response is to say, but this is involvement. No, it's not. Read the judge manual. This is a regret debate, which means regretting their involvement regrets everything that happened. We can pick a part of their involvement, prove it was structurally likely to occur but would not result in the same thing, and then explain that would be preferable. That's perfectly allowed. Second thing, we explain that as the war goes on, because of the economic and dying political will, you're less likely to become an asset in the final place. But thirdly, we explain that, like, if you're being used as a battering ram, that there are a series of other trade-offs that you have to think as this actor and question whether or not being useful for Russia is actually worth coming at the expense of the following 5 things. First of all, we explain that because people are dying, labour is way harder to replace because it is incredibly high skilled, and people don't want to join you now because you're seen as Russia's little puppet dog and not an independent and effective PMC. Secondly, we explain that you are less likely to accept contracts now because you have less numbers to work with, and so the total volume of contracts you can accept is actually less, which means you make less money. Thirdly, we explain that you now can't accept certain contracts if you are super reliant on Russia or you're heavily integrated into them, because many of those contracts are things that Russia might not want you doing, for example. Fourthly, we explain that less contracts are offered to you because you have a reputation or perception as being super aligned with Russia. And fifthly, as is already stated, we explain that less people sign up. So that then explains why their main win strategy, which is you get a shit ton of benefits from being integrated with Russia, is first of all untrue and doesn't apply in the majority of situations, and secondly can be outweighed by the overall efficacy of this organisation into the long term not being profitable. Now, I will introduce 2 additional burdens on this team by explaining counterfactually why we would be fine, and therefore they have to prove a significant benefit to engaging in this war for it to outweigh the likely counterfactual, which is that you would have been fine anyway. They say 2 things. The first thing they say is that refusing the offer from Russia jeopardizes your goodwill. We preempt this argument at first, and Oscar explains in a series of ways why Russia would not be in a good position to retaliate at that point in time, why it's not in their interest when they're already worrying about securing the war in other ways. And if you believe Ellie's response at second, then this doesn't largely occur anyway. Their response at second, negative it is, is to explain that, well, now you have to work with Russia's allies at the moment, and so saying no to Russia means saying no to all of those contracts. But that's not what the PMC group does. The reason why the PMC group is useful to Russia specifically is because they go into a bunch of conflicts that Russia currently doesn't have an ally with, they work with them, they help those individuals, and then they say, go funnel yourself towards Russia, Russia will now support you, here's a bunch of information on the specific organizational structure of this regime that we've toppled. Russia then comes in with the exact perfect offer for them, and they accept. So, if you believe that is true, you must also believe that not allying yourself with Russia in the ways that they describe does not mean that Russia would be mad at you, because you would still be generating interest for allies to then go and move to Russia. But I just want to now do a bit of weighing here, because if you believe that we established that there are viable alternatives, which you should for 4 reasons. Firstly, because we proved that you can do a lot of these conflicts more easily while still making the same amount of money. Secondly, because you don't incur all the previous harms I outlined with respect to things like sanctions and the labour force being dwindled. Fourthly, because there are shorter conflicts, which means the amount of money you make per unit of time is greater. And fifthly, because the operations are more tailored to those individual skills, which explains why you're likely to be more successful at those operations and incur less net losses per operation. All explains why the burden on this team is absolutely massive. They have to outweigh all of that material. They have to outweigh the fact that there are a series of other jobs that you just could have otherwise engaged in. They provide no analysis to believe that those jobs would not be available to you. But the second burden that I will explain is that they don't just have to weigh out that. They have to weigh out our crowding out mechanism, which explains that those options are not available to you in the long term now, which means even if relatively in the time since this has occurred, the options were relatively similar, they have to prove why being allied with Russia into the long term is good and is worth trading off for all of these opportunities that you now don't have access to, because as is not responded to, Oscar explains that basically you leaving means a whole bunch of people have taken these contracts and business opportunities. They don't do any of that. Let's see what third neg does, but I'm pretty sure we win.
I'm going to start this speech by explaining that Wagner Group probably would have lost its independence, its sovereignty, and been disbanded had they never been involved in the Ukraine war. And the reason I'm going to start here is because it's by far the easiest way in which we take this debate, because this interest is logically prior to every single other interest in this debate. If you do not exist, there's no interest that you can service. Otherwise, you need to exist to have some sort of interest. If the Kremlin would have disbanded you, that means that is something that entirely disintegrates your interest. And our claim was here that if Wagner Group had decided to not get involved in the Ukrainian war, then the Ukrainian war, which is an incredibly important Russian ideological war, then the Kremlin would have shut you down at the very first instance. They would have done things like poisoned Prigozhin. They would have done things like, refuse to hand over the convicts that make up your paramilitary forces. They would have done things like, stopped allowing your exceptions to international law and, handed over members of Wagner Group to international criminal courts to get them tried. It would have meant that they stopped them from participating in Russian financial systems. That meant they can't access their assets and perform their job at all. That meant that Wagner Group effectively got shut down if they did not participate in the Ukraine war. None of those interests continue to exist. What are the responses that we hear from this affirmative team as to why they would have still, participated? Russia would have allowed them to, continue to exist. The main one, and I think the best iteration of this comes out at Ellie's speech. Congratulations to Ellie. Is that you still give a lot of other benefits to Russia because of the fact that you can operate by virtue of special military operations in the Ukraine, or you can do things like proper African dictators. Therefore, you provide some sort of benefit, and you can still continue to exist. Two layers of response here. Firstly, I think it is deeply unclear that the things they identify here are actually different forms of benefit. The things are actually benefits that are worthy to Russia. The African involvement is probably pretty tangential to Russia's interests. We also identified to you in Connor's speech that special military operations in Ukraine are involvement that you are not allowed to do in this debate. You can't just say that you would have done them. I guess the Hail Mary that we hear at Third Affirmative is that, well, you can regret this, we can regret the involvement as it exists right now, but you can substantially change it. This is just not within the spirit of the motion. But also, they never proved why the Kremlin would have allowed that to happen, right? They never proved that the Kremlin would have allowed one type of involvement and not another. The Kremlin hires you for one specific thing, not for another specific thing. Why would the Kremlin allow you to do this if it's not in their interest? They probably would want you, to participate more deeply. And that leads me on to the second response that I have to this idea of you're still providing Russia a benefit. And this is really important. Even if you are providing Russia with some form of a benefit, this isn't the analysis that the Kremlin is engaging with. That is to say that in their eyes, if Wagner Group is not helping in the war in Ukraine, that is a huge betrayal of Russia, because there is the opportunity then for them to help Russia when they are not engaging in that war. That is something that is incredibly detrimental. That is something that is seen as a huge betrayal of that, a loss of that trust at their most important time, at their time of need. Wagner Group is saying, no, we will not do that. Even if other benefits exist to Russia that Wagner Group is providing, they are not doing what they maximally can do for Russia. That is something that means that Wagner Group is not acting in Russia's interest. That is something that means that Russia still gets really pissed at you and still shuts Wagner Group down. So at the end of this, we've proven that Wagner Group probably no longer exists under their counterfactual, which means that all their crap about we would have done other things in Africa do not accrue, because they simply would not have happened, because there was not the capacity within Wagner Group for that to happen. We win this debate of that entirely. Now I'm just going to do some margin extending. So let's look at two further questions then in this speech. I'm first going to talk about if Wagner Group does continue to exist, about why they lose credibility into the long term and and cannot retain their contracts under their side of the house. And then I'm going to talk about the more short-term interests, about losing your soldiers and stuff like that. Noting that obviously the long-term interests are ones that are far more important, because that is how you get your ability to to get a bunch of money into the future, to be awarded contracts from both Russia and from African dictators. So we hear two main claims from side Affirmative. The first is that there is a huge amount of tension, that the Ukraine war has caused a huge amount of tension between the Kremlin and Wagner Group, so you don't get a bunch of work. And their big mechanism for this is that Prigozhin has criticized Russia's strategy and criticized the Kremlin in the way that they've acted. But obviously, just because you've criticized someone does not mean that you've had a loss of an economic relationship with that person, right? This happens on international forums all the time, where you see people criticize one another about certain strategies, but you still engage them in an economic fashion more than you ever have before. See, for example, the relationships between Australia and China. I would suggest that maybe even if it's a relationship that is less cordial between Wagner Group and the Kremlin, that is still one that is incredibly intertwined. You don't need to be buddy-buddy with the Kremlin to get a bunch of work from them. You need to be deeply intertwined within their systems, and that is the thing that gets you the ability to actually get those contracts in the very first place. And that's where our claim comes in. Because what we explained to you down the bench was that now Wagner Group is far more tied into the Kremlin and into its processes, right? Because we told you that Russia has become reliant on Wagner Group, and that is the thing that gets you work into the future. That is the thing that gets you the exorbitant fees that are paid to Wagner Group, that gets you the huge amount of weapons that you get from that you get by virtue of your good relationship with Russia. The claim that they make in response to this is, well, Russia has old weapons, they're not a good ally to have. A couple of responses. Firstly, maybe some of them are old, some of them are also like new, right? I don't think this is particularly important. Secondly though, Russia can also do things like hook you up with their supplies. For example, Russia gets preferential price deals with Chinese weapons manufacturers, and now Wagner Group can get access to those sorts of things to get their weapons for a far cheaper price. Thirdly, their argument here doesn't respond to the reputational boost that you get, right? Because we explained to you that you get a far better perception from Russia's allies, and Russia can impute you into those allies to get you contracts with those people. So for example, this could look like Iran now hiring Wagner Group because they've seen that they've done such a good job with Russia. So I don't think their claim here stands. I don't think you can say like, well, just because Wagner Group has criticized the Kremlin means that the Kremlin does not want to be involved with them. I think we've proven far more conclusively that there is a pretty strong link there. The second affirmative team claim here that they make as to why you don't get contracts into the long term is that actually, Wagner Group has not done a good job for Russia. They've actually gotten owned. A couple of responses here. Firstly, that it is just patently untrue, because there have been certain decisive battles in which Wagner Group has been pivotal for Russia's victory. See, for example, the battle in Bakhmut, where Wagner Group was able to, defeat certain choke points that allowed for the Russian government that allowed for Wagner Group to actually win and, get past those issues that the Russian government was having. That was an incredible show of success for those governments. But secondly, there are just structural reasons why the government does a good job. Firstly, we proved to you that if it was true that Wagner Group was doing such a terrible job, then they would not continue to get hired by the Russian government and by external actors to the Russian government. But secondly, we proved to you that they're a specially trained military corps that can actually do a vast variety of acts. Our claim here is that you get far greater contracts in the future because you've now displayed your abilities on an international stage. Far more countries are willing to give you those exceptions to your international legal status. You get way more contracts into the future. At the end of this, we've explained to you why Wagner Group is far more monetarily successful way into the future. Now let's deal then with, now that we've won that clash too, let's then talk about the short-term interest that this affirmative team points out to saying that, well, if all your troops are dead, how can you do future work? You just hire future workers, right? Mercenaries come to Wagner Group, and you come to Wagner Group because they get paid a huge amount of money to fight for that group. You have a huge labor supply which you can pull on. But secondly, I would simply note that even though maybe a lot of your troops have died, they're oftentimes the least worthless sorts of troops, right? It's oftentimes convicts. They say, well, some good troops died. Yes, but many of those good troops also survived. Thirdly, it's also just deeply unclear why this depletes your labor pool. People want to come to Wagner Group because they are so well paid. The final thing that they say is that, well, you actually didn't help that much in the war in Ukraine, so this doesn't serve that interest. But what we told you is that this doesn't serve the monetary interest, this serves the patriotic interest of the Wagner Group, which are also incredibly important. At the end of this, Wagner Group ceases to exist, but even if you don't believe that, we proved to you that they get more work into the future. Those dead troops aren't that big of a deal. Very proud to negate.
The first question I'll ask in this reply is, do you need to be on the Kremlin's good side? Because that is effectively this team's only way at evading the series of harms that we bring to you if you are not. And I would just note at the top of this reply that just because this team says that is able to prove that the status quo is bad for Wagner on a net level, that the war in Ukraine has harms and is bad, by the rules of the judging manual, they need to prove that the counterfactual would have been better, and we explained that the counterfactual would have been much worse, even if the state of affairs right now, losing a few people who are pretty valuable to you, who are pretty good mercenaries, is bad. The alternatives would have been much worse. So let's move to this question of whether you need to be on the Kremlin's good side. We explained that you need to for a few reasons. The first is that because you do not have any legal way of existing otherwise, you have no legal right to assert as an organization, to store profit, to make profit, to engage with anyone at arm's length and in contractual deals otherwise, and that means that the looming threat of a crackdown at any time could exist. And we tell you down the bench as well that threat of a crackdown has receded, the hand of Putin has detached itself somewhat from your neck, or perhaps the teapot that contains the poison has tipped back a little bit there, because precisely of the bargaining chip that involvement in the hot conflict in Ukraine gives you. That immediate chokehold has Putin by the balls, so to speak. The second reason we give as to why you need to be on the Kremlin's good side is that because you rely symbiotically on many functions of the state, turning a blind eye to your operations, providing institutional backing among it and its allies in order to allow you to maintain profitability, and also providing, for instance, disposable convict soldiers that you can deploy in a variety of conflicts, including in Ukraine. We thirdly explain that you rely on an international on an international basis of relations that Russia maintains, that you can access other government contracts. Many of the most lucrative ones that are wars that require quite a lot of long-term strategic involvement are only accessible via Russian ally states as clients, rather than just protecting a random gold mine or a random diamond mine. Then, second question in this reply then is, can you stay on the Kremlin's good side? Otherwise, would the counterfactual indeed have been okay for you? Affirmative says that you can because you could have been useful in other ways. What are those other ways? The first that they give is that you could have propped up some useful African dictators. There are three problems with this. One, don't explain why those African dictators are particularly useful and why they care about them. They don't prove that they care about it, really importantly, any more than they care about the enormous revealed preference that is winning a conflict in Ukraine, a preference that started now decades ago, and a piece of political messaging that is decades old at this point. The second way they insist you can still be useful is that, well, you can do other operations that get them money. One, never explain why this money or even how this money gets back into the hands of the Kremlin. Two, if it does, seems bad for Wagner Group, and seems in fact that this relationship, disproportionate bargaining power, that situation, in fact strips you of more of your profits associated with those other lucrative and low kind of risk operations like protecting gold mines, protecting diamond mines. The third way that they insist that you can be useful is what I will call lipstick involvement in Ukraine, by things like providing strategic analysis, strategic support at other points there. And the biggest problem with this is they just do not explain why this would be allowed. For instance, all of that access to the tactical information of that regime, or I think more damningly, why at some point that involvement would not spiral into the precise kind of involvement that this team is bound to regret. Why you would be allowed to indefinitely just provide strategic support and indefinitely provide kind of like elliptic responses to the conflict in Ukraine with no expectation of becoming further involved in the future. And I think that is just deeply unlikely. Increasing desperate calls for involvement, for boots on the ground, for protecting Russian lives, for securing those choke points in Crimea, in the Donbass, and in other annexed regions as well. It just seems very unlikely to me that the Wagner Group of side Affirmative is a Wagner Group that has at all a relationship with the Kremlin, that exists at all, that is allowed to continue to profit at all, that benefits from the special legal and geopolitical relationship that Wagner can have with many of its clients now. Incredibly proud to negate.
This negative team needs to walk a tight rope over a large cliff for you to believe their win strategy. In order to cast your ballot for them, you need to believe the following narrative. The Wagner Group has been associated with the greatest successes in the entire Ukraine war. This has entrenched their standing within the Kremlin and their international reputation. If they didn't do this involvement, they would be a mere symbiote of the Kremlin and would have been otherwise disbanded. Let's take a closer look at the way this house of cards collapses in a heap in this negative team's lap. First, we explained that a crackdown that disbands the Wagner Group is an incredibly unlikely response to not involving themselves in the way that they have currently. First, because we explained that the counterfactual involvement, i.e. greater involvement in Russia's strategic interests in the Middle East and North Africa, which we extensively explained at Ellie and Ben, is also in Russia's interests and also would have a curry favour with the Kremlin. But additionally, we can claim, and there is substantial discussion about this in second and third negative, that we regret their involvement, i.e. getting into a hot conflict where 30,000 people died, and suggest that there might have been a world in which they engaged in a different way, i.e. using the expertise they have in military strategy and weaponry in order to be involved in that conflict in a way that would have been pretty unlikely that that involvement led to a Russian crackdown that disbanded the Wagner Group. And obviously they concede later in their case and in other parts of the debate that the Russian government is tolerable of criticism, like they need this for other arguments in their case to operate, which makes this argument even less likely. So, if you believe nothing else about this point, you must ask here why the counterfactual in Connor's speech is a win condition. I ask genuinely, what is the harm of remaining a Kremlin symbiote, if you bought that characterization, right? Like, they have conceded that they're ideologically aligned, as they argue in second negative, and can operate to make money overseas and make the owners of the Wagner Group rich as a Kremlin symbiote. And it seems to me like the incentive and the impact that we persistently weigh in this debate still lands in that world, in that characterization in which it is still a Kremlin symbiote. Now, thus far I have assumed that this negative team conclusively gets the characterization that they wanted, but we contested it heavily, obviously. We say the Wagner's relationship with the Kremlin has deteriorated, and in order to weigh in this our favour, you just must compare the intuitiveness of claims that is made in this arena of the debate. On one hand, you have Oscar is buying into propaganda. Of course the reason that the Wagner Group is criticizing Putin and Prigozhin is because, it's because Putin is strategically planting his opposition. Like, that's the reason Prigozhin went nutso. On the other hand, you have Prigozhin and Wagner have been critical of the Kremlin. This has led to the Russian government to seek greater involvement within its affairs. Two facts the ordinary intelligent voter would know, two things that are incredibly intuitive. For that reason, it's quite doubtful that this has helped the Wagner Group's relationship with the Kremlin in any way that they describe in this debate. So it's absurd at this point to think that in the absence of any of that being true for the negative team, that they can possibly win. They claim that the vast majority of deaths in the Ukraine war by the Wagner Group have been guys that have been taken from prison, was disastrously unproven, because it relies on a logical leap, which is, most casualties come from this, right? Which they just don't prove. Maybe they prove that some of Wagner's soldiers have been from people taken directly from prison, but this is necessarily an incomplete argument, because they don't explain why it's the majority, and it's also necessarily mitigatory. It's even less clear that losing a hot war is perceived well and is super epic and awesome for the Wagner Group. I think it's intuitive that if you lose a hot war and lots of personnel, you see Michael Week and fucking PMC. That is an incredibly intuitive claim. It's even less clear the vast increase in sanctions on Prigozhin and other Wagner fat cats has been an awesome win for them. Look, I thought I might be tempting fate by suggesting this was an epic aff in the early moments of my 1A, but at the dying seconds of this debate, I feel vindicated. This was a loss for the Wagner Group, and I regret it. If no one else, vote out.